There are a lot of different factors that contribute to maintaining a healthy vegetable garden, but probably the most important one is building and maintaining healthy soil. So a few months ago, when I transformed this plot from a patch of abandoned lawn and dead weeds into this fertile vegetable garden, I added a bunch of compost and other organic soil amendments to our heavy clay soil. And our garden has thrived all summer. But as the summer's gone on, these plants have put on a lot of flowers and fruit, and they're using up a lot of those nutrients. So I always like to add organic fertilizer just about every 6 to 8 weeks as the summer goes on. I'm Kyle from Urban Farmstead, and in this video I'm going to show you the fertilizer that I use for my garden and just talk a little bit more about fertilizing your summer garden so that you can get heavy crops throughout the summer in your garden. One of my most frequently asked questions, especially recently after posting my summer garden tour, has been, what do you fertilize your garden with? And I'll definitely show you exactly what I use and how I use it, because it's an organic fertilizer that I've been using now for almost 10 years. And that's longer than most of the other things in my garden process have stayed consistent. And it's because it's a fertilizer that has worked really, really well for me, and I would recommend it to anybody. But this video is not sponsored by this organic fertilizer company. It's not sponsored by anybody. And it would be easy for me to just say, here's what I use, follow the instructions on the package, and you're gonna have great results. But I think it's really important to at least have a general understanding of how fertilizer works and what to look for in fertilizer packaging so that you can find the best fertilizer for your garden. So let's just talk a little bit about that first. So here's one of the fertilizers that I use, and I'll use this package as an example. See these three numbers right here? This is known as the NPK ratio, and these are the three macronutrients responsible for all plant growth. And they're always in this same order: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So the first number represents the percent of nitrogen in this fertilizer. The second number represents the percent of phosphorus in this fertilizer. And the third number represents the amount of potassium in this fertilizer. You can see this is a 5-5-5, which means this is like the epitome of what is called a balanced fertilizer. It's got equal parts of all three of those macronutrients. But in addition to those macronutrients, most fertilizers also have a lot of micronutrients that are also important, and you can find information about that somewhere else in the packaging. This one lists calcium and sulfur and some of the other nutrients that are in this fertilizer, but for the purpose of this video, we're just going to focus on the NPK. So we'll start with the first number, nitrogen. Nitrogen is responsible for the green vegetative growth of a plant, and as long as a plant is growing, it's using nitrogen. But nitrogen is also the most likely nutrient to be depleted in your soil, because not only are plants constantly taking it up, but it's also lost over time through natural processes like leaching. So it's always important during any season to add nitrogen to your soil, especially when you're planting, and especially during the early stages as plants are developing from seedlings into larger plants so that they can be vibrant, healthy, and vigorous enough to support heavy crops later in the season. That said, you can also add too much nitrogen. So in the summertime, after plants are developed and they're starting to put on flowers and fruit, adding too much nitrogen fertilizer will cause plants to grow too quickly and become too full, and that's when you get that big, beautiful tomato plant that has little to no tomatoes. So don't add too much nitrogen in summer. In summer, I'll switch to a more balanced fertilizer like this. Although this is not the exact fertilizer that I'm using this time of year, it would be perfectly fine, and it's a good example because it still has some nitrogen, but it also has plenty of phosphorus and potassium. That second number, phosphorus, is responsible for root development and flowers and fruiting, and that's really what we want to promote a lot of this time of year as we're growing tomatoes and peppers and zucchini and cucumbers and all of those plants that need to create flowers and fruit. In addition to that, it also has plenty of potassium. Potassium is responsible for general plant health, disease resistance, and just vigor overall. But in order for your plants to take full advantage of any of these nutrients, it's important for your soil pH to be within the optimal range, which for a vegetable garden is typically between 6 and 6.5. Alright, I think that's enough soil science for this video, but if you want to geek out on soil science a little bit more, or if you have any questions about testing your soil to find out the micronutrients, the macronutrients, the pH of your soil, I have a full video on that, even comparing different home soil test kits, so I'll link that video here. But for now, let's go over to the next row, and I'm going to talk about some different types of fertilizers, and I'll show you what I'm using. When it comes to different sources of fertilizer, there are a lot of different options such as compost, worm castings, cover crops, granular fertilizers, liquid fertilizers, and pretty much all of those can be either organic or inorganic. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about inorganic or chemical fertilizers in this video, but just know that I only use organics, and the decision to use organics over chemicals is an entire separate video. So I'll surely do one of those, but if you are using chemicals in your garden, whether they're for fertilizer or for pesticides or herbicides, I strongly encourage you to look into the benefits of switching over to organics, and just in general understand that the short-term instant gratification that you might be getting from using chemical pesticides and chemical fertilizers will definitely be overshadowed by the long-term benefits that you get from using organics, because over time, when you're using chemicals as pesticides or as fertilizers, they will degrade your soil, whereas when you use organics, they will continue to build living soil. Compost is the most natural form of fertilizer. It's how most of the plants in nature are getting their nutrients. Leaves, fruits, all kinds of stuff falls to the ground, it decomposes, and then it gets taken up in the roots and becomes nutrients that help the plant thrive. And that's the same thing that we're simulating when we're making compost at home. And if we're not making enough compost at home, we're not making any compost at home, we can buy bags of compost from our local nursery, or if I need a lot of it, I'll drive my truck to the local landscape yard and I'll just buy a load of it and I'll bring it here to the yard and I'll mix that in. So there's all different ways to get compost, and there's different ways to use it. I always apply a thick layer of compost in spring and fall right before I'm about to plant. And you can use compost to feed your garden pretty much any time of the year, and it's going to be great. But for me, I pretty much just use it in those spring and fall planting times. And then worm compost is very similar to regular compost, also called vermicompost or worm castings, but instead of just microscopic organisms doing all of that decomposing, the worms are doing the majority of the work. And you get a lot of other benefits that you don't get from regular compost. Vermicompost is a great way to neutralize those heavy metals in your soil, and the worms actually add a natural plant growth hormone to the compost as they decompose it. So worm castings are super valuable, and just like with regular compost, you can make vermicompost at home very easily, and I'll be making a video very soon showing my system for that, but you can also buy it by the bag at your local nursery. And so that's a great thing to add to your soil at the same time you're adding regular compost. But what I really love to do with it is to make worm compost tea and use it as a liquid fertilizer any time of the year. Another option of liquid fertilizer is liquid kelp or liquid fish, or like this EB Stone product, it's a mixture of liquid fish and liquid kelp. And it's a great natural organic fertilizer that you can just mix in a water can and water it right in. You can put it on the soil, you can do it as a foliar spray, whatever you want. And it can be applied any time of year, but I mostly apply this to my seedlings as they're sprouting in very early spring or late winter, and then I'll water our plants in with it when I plant, and I use it a lot in the winter time. But this is a 4-1-1, so it's mostly nitrogen, so it's going to encourage a lot of green foliage growth, so I'm not really applying it in spring or midsummer when I want to make fruit and flowers. This time of year, what I'm using is a granular fertilizer, and I really like this EB Stone tomato and vegetable food. Now this is a 4-5-3, so it's got a 4 for nitrogen, still plenty of nitrogen to keep up with the foliage growth, which is still necessary at this point, but then a 5 and a 3 for phosphate and potassium, but it also has calcium in it. It's got 3% calcium, and you won't see calcium in these numbers. You have to look at the back of whatever fertilizer you're getting. Calcium is very important. If you've ever gotten blossom end rot, if you haven't, it's when the base of your tomato starts to rot, and that's because of a calcium deficiency. Now, it's not always because there's not enough calcium in the soil. That's again another video. There's different things that can contribute to that, but it's necessary to add calcium to your soil, especially with tomatoes, peppers, pretty much every summer crop. So this has got calcium, it's got mycorrhizae, it's got beneficial bacteria, and I'm not here to endorse this product, but it's a local family-owned business, and I know it's not available in a lot of parts of the country, a lot of parts of the world. So if you can't find this exact product, see if you can find something similar to this at your local nursery. The fertilizers that I use, I apply just about every other month. So I start with a starter fertilizer in spring. 2 months later, I will add this tomato and vegetable fertilizer. 2 months later, which is pretty much now, I'll add more tomato and vegetable fertilizer, and then that'll finish me off for the rest of the season. So I'm really applying fertilizer every 2 months, and I'm doing that year round because fortunately for me here in California, I'm able to grow crops year round. So every 2 months, I'm fertilizing. All right, little pause. I don't know if you've seen my full garden tour video yet, but look at these tomatillos. I've got a yellow tomatillo that's long and crazy. It's called a Queen of Malinalco, and this awesome purple tomatillo. You might be used to seeing just regular green tomatillos, which I also grow, but how awesome are these things? And if you grow your own tomatillos, they are delicious and sweet. This one tastes like tropical fruit, straight from the vine. All right, that was a good break. Let's go over one more row over to the tomatoes, and I will show you how I fertilize. Enough talk, a little more action. When it comes to how to apply fertilizer to your vegetable garden, I'm going to continue my trend of suggesting that you read what it says on the back of the bag. The most important information there is how much you should apply because, as I said, all different fertilizers come in different concentrations. This fertilizer here is supposed to be applied 3 cups per 50 square feet or 3 cups per 50-foot row, 1 feet wide. This is a 10-foot long row, so honestly I'll be doing about a handful, which is less than a cup. The nice thing about organic fertilizers compared to chemical fertilizers, one of the things, is that it's very difficult to over-fertilize them and burn them. You can over-fertilize them and give them too many nutrients of one thing or another, like if you give them too much nitrogen, they'll get too much vegetative growth and not enough fruit. But with a chemical fertilizer, if I give them 2 times too much, I can burn the plant to the point of actually killing it. With organic fertilizers, if you put too much, eventually it's just going to break down and consume. It's kind of like a slow release fertilizer. So I usually don't measure it out. And if I apply too much, if I apply too little, I don't have a bad consequence unless I'm like way out of the amount that's recommended. So always look at the recommendations, but as a general rule, and it says it on the back of this bag and should on any bag, the most important thing is to make sure that your plants are well irrigated prior to fertilizing and then irrigate them again afterwards. So I watered all of our garden yesterday. It had time to soak up that water and it's nice and healthy. Now it's got enough water to support all of the fertilizer that I'm going to be feeding this plant. Then after I feed it, I'm just going to work it into the top of the soil. So I don't want to just put it on top of mulch and leave it there. I do want to work it into the top layer of the soil, and then I'll water it again. And then it's going to slowly break down and feed these plants over the next couple of months. So all I'm doing is just spreading about a handful of fertilizer all along the drip line here. And then once it's spread on the top, I'll just work it into the top few inches of soil. And then as you water, the soil microbes, the worms, and everything in the soil will bring those nutrients to where they need to be at the roots of the plants. And now I'll just continue to fertilize the rest of our tomatoes the same way. And it doesn't matter whether it's a cherry tomato, a beefsteak tomato, the variety doesn't matter at all. The only real determination on fertilizing tomatoes is whether or not it's a determinate versus indeterminate. So a determinate tomato is going to get all of its crop at once, and by August it's probably had that crop and either harvested or ready to harvest, and it's not going to put on any new fruit. So there's really no reason to fertilize them unless it's a second planting for you. But an indeterminate variety like this will continue to put on new fruit. And in our zone 9B, here with our long growing season, I have 6 to 8 weeks left in our tomato growing season. So I'll fertilize today and maybe even one more time. I also use this same fertilizer for our peppers, whether they're spicy or mild. And in fact, I use this fertilizer for all of our summer vegetables. Our cucumbers, our zucchini, our eggplant, anything that flowers and fruits. But there is one section of our summer garden where I'm not using this fertilizer. So let's go talk about that. The one and only section of my summer garden where I'm not using that fertilizer is here in the herb garden. This is basil, and of course I grow this for its leaves. So I want it to have a lot of that nice leafy green vegetative growth and not too many flowers. You can see it's starting to flower, and while there's a lot of different things you can do, such as pruning your basil to keep it from flowering, which is the most important, I also want to give it the right fertilizer. So if I give it a fertilizer with a lot of potassium and phosphorus and low nitrogen, it's going to want to flower more. If I give it something high in nitrogen, like that 411, that fish emulsion and kelp, it will encourage more leafing. That being said, I also want to keep pruning off these flowers. That will encourage more branching. But this is the only section of my garden that I'm not using that fertilizer. If you're in a cooler area and you're growing kale and Swiss chard and some other somewhat heat tolerant plants in your summer garden, also you want to use a fertilizer that's higher in nitrogen with less phosphorus and potassium. So summer fruits and vegetables, you want high in phosphorus and potassium and a little bit of nitrogen. The leafy greens, whether you're growing them in winter or summer, you want higher in nitrogen, lower in phosphorus and potassium. When people ask me what I use to fertilize my vegetable garden, I'm always happy to share. But I also hope that people understand there's way more to growing vegetables than just adding a good fertilizer. It's about healthy soil that's a blend of nutrient-rich topsoil with plenty of organic matter. And it's alive with soil microbes and beneficial bacteria. But even if you build that perfect garden soil when you first put in your garden, it's necessary to introduce new nutrients each season, whether it's in the form of compost, organic fertilizer, cover crops, or maybe a mix of each. And if you properly manage that soil by never tilling after the initial till and only using organic soil inputs, that soil will continue to grow and improve each season. If you have any questions about how I manage the soil in my vegetable gardens, or any garden questions at all, ask them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, and if you want to see more videos like this, consider subscribing. Happy gardening, everyone.